We know Zion, Murray, Ingram, McCollum, and others will get minutes, but what do players like Jordan Hawkins, Yves Missi, Antonio Reeves, and others need to do to earn a spot in the rotation? I'm going to tell you in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Friday. We went Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday this week. It'll still be a little bit irregular for about 2 more weeks. Then we're back to 5 days a week here on Locked On Pelicans. But we're going to look at the rotation. We don't need to get into some of the big name guys. We know they're going to get minutes. We'll talk about their roles maybe next week a little bit too. But I want to look at some of the other guys who's going to fill out the rest of the roster. And we'll look at kind of the overall rotation and how this could kind of work and what guys need to show in training camp and preseason to earn an actual spot. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. So let's get into this here a little bit and talk overall the general rotation first and how it could potentially look. By the way, today's episode of Locked On Pelicans brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 2nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So when trying to kind of figure out the rotation that Willie Green is going to run this year, 11 guys got like solid minutes last season, and that's with injuries in the mix. So it's really like a 9.5, 10-man rotation is truthfully what they really probably want to try and run. Look, Zion's going to get minutes. Ingram is going to get minutes. Dejounte Murray is going to get minutes. Herb Jones, CJ, and Trey Murphy III will all play. Like, we're not worried about them whatsoever. It's the rest of it. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guys. 6 guys. So if we're going to just go with 11 guys who could get minutes, let's look at some of the rest of the roster. Maybe you can kind of cut it down to 10. And we'll look at by positional grouping as well here in today's show. So let's start with the centers, because that's the biggest open question right now. And it's also honestly the most, I don't want to say competitive, but there's a logjam of players there, none of them necessarily great options. Think about how many centers they have here. You have Daniel Theis, Yves Missi, Karlo Matkovic, Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, and don't forget about Trey Jemison, who's on a 2-way deal with the New Orleans Pelicans. We'll talk about him a good bit in this segment because I think that's maybe an unsung guy that could play some significant minutes here. So last year, they ran 2 centers. It was Jonas Valanciunas and Larry Nance Jr. There were very few, lineups that didn't feature one of those 2 players out there just because that was the centers and they weren't running Zion at the 5 a lot. Herb at the 5 a lot isn't exactly what you want to do yet either. So if Willie Green, that's the big question, wants to run a traditional center, how do these guys earn minutes? So let's kind of go through them one by one here to talk about what they would need to show or where they would need to improve their games. So first and foremost, you have Daniel Theis, the presumed starter, even though I wouldn't say that is like a lock or anything close to it. He's a decent enough backup that will get minutes because, he's the most experienced of the group by far, but he's undersized at 6'8", does play bigger than he is, and is much tougher than you would imagine given his size. As long as he's setting solid screens and defending on the perimeter and maybe knocking down a shot on occasion, he can play. Right? He'll be able to play for this team. The center position does not need to do a lot for the New Orleans Pelicans. And we've seen that Willie Green wants guys to defend on the perimeter. If you can do that as a center in their switching scheme, you're going to be able to get minutes. When we go into the wings and the guards in the next segment here, this is going to be a big factor too. Right? When it comes to head coach Willie Green, you want to be on the court, you got to play defense. It's as simple as that, for better or worse. So Tice, if he can just hold his own on the perimeter, is going to fit right on in. If you can move a little bit, he'll play. Really as simple as that. He kind of has the inside track, I think, when it comes to minutes. The next guy, though, that I find really intriguing here is Karlo Matkovic, because he looked really good in Summer League. Looked like an NBA player that really belonged. And I was on our Locked On Fantasy Basketball show the other day, and we talked a lot about him for a while because Josh Lloyd was really high on him. He was there in Summer League watching all of the games and seemed really, really excited by what he saw from Karlo. You know, when you look at Karlo, his way to earning minutes is in a couple of different areas. You know, he's a pick and roll big man. They don't really have another one of those on this roster right now. So if you can add that dimension offensively, I think he's going to be in a good spot to play. A pick and roll big that can play above the rim as a little bit of a lob threat. And you saw all of that from him in Summer League. That's his path to playing time. That's what he does differently or better than any other big man on the roster, at least right now. He showed enough mobility on the perimeter that I would assume he's going to kind of be the backup center for this team, maybe to start. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have a big role, but at least means you're getting minutes. You know, they started with Jonas Valanciunas, closed with Larry Nance Jr., so you go with your traditional big, then your small ball big. Here it's a little bit of a reverse. While I don't think Daniel Tice is a small ball big, he plays like a regular big. You know, you kind of go with that, and then you have Karlo Matkovic off the bench, and I think that is maybe the direction that they're going to go. But if he can play in the pick and roll like that, in the short roll, and be a lob threat, a vertical spacing threat, even though that's not as good as a three-point threat, that'll work. He showed a little bit of an ability to shoot. He showed off some rim protection, even though I don't think that's something that he's going to be very good at the NBA. But I trust that he'll be able to defend on the perimeter, that he'll be able to move side to side a little bit. So I think he's going to really be in the running. So let's keep going down the list here. And the next one is going to be Yves Missi. The way he gets on the court is by being a shot blocker. No one is expecting the offense to really be there for him. I don't expect him to be a good pick and roll big man just yet, having not really had that kind of role at Baylor or that experience at the NBA level yet, or even just professionally like Karlo has. The way he earns minutes is by blocking shots and being a rim protector and defending the interior in the paint. If he can do that, they will try and find a way to play him because he has an ability to do that on a level that nobody else does here on this roster. If he doesn't do that well to start, giving him minutes isn't going to do much and is going to probably be at a detriment to the team given the very real offensive limitations that he has. But if he can block some shots, you can throw him out there when you need him against some of those teams with other big men that you need to really defend against or guards that attack. And if the Pelicans maybe change their defensive scheme, and we're not expecting them to do that, having him out there is definitely going to help, I think, and be a little bit of a deterrent. That's really his path to getting minutes at the NBA level this season, I think. If that doesn't come around or he's not effective or he's fouling, and that was my big concern with him, I think that's where you'll see him kind of glued to the bench in the G League for the majority of the year. So let's push the next two guys to the next segment here because we've gone a little long. I want to look at Jeremiah Robinson-Earl and Trey Jemison because I think those are guys we're maybe not talking enough about who could have roles, significant roles, I think, with this team. And I'll tell you what they need to do. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We got something a little bit different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game, and all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel at any time. So get on over to FanDuel. You've got LSU versus USC in Vegas this weekend. LSU is a 4.5-point favorite. They're minus 4.5. That USC team plays no defense. I like taking the minus 4.5 here. I think LSU wins big. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook and get that 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket. FanDuel, the official sportsbook of Locked On and America's #1 sportsbook. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday. If you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. And I promise we'll be back to 5 days a week before you know it. We'll be breaking down the rotation. Who starts, right? Who needs to be traded? What moves do they need to make? We're going to break it all down for you here on the Locked On Pelicans podcast. Now for your second listen, Locked On NBA. There's no off season in the NBA, and Locked On NBA is providing daily basketball analysis in 30 minutes or less. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Locked On NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm on there every Wednesday. At least listen on Wednesdays to Locked On NBA. Cool to get like the local New Orleans national, guy on the national show. I think is pretty awesome. Ross Jackson, by the way, hosts an episode per week of Locked On NFL too. A lot of NOLA representation on there here with Locked On. So let's keep talking about how guys can earn spots in the rotation because we have 6 guys that are going to play. There's maybe 5 other guys that are going to get minutes, maybe 2 of them being centers. And that means that when we talk Jordan Hawkins, Javonte Green, Matt Ryan, Jose Alvarado, Antonio Reeves, the minutes start to dry up pretty quickly. And then we'll finish up today's show kind of looking at the general rotation talk and what Willie Green likes to do and how that might fit into some of this as well and what could change next year too. And we'll probably do another show fully on that as well. So 2 more centers to really talk about here. And let's start with Jeremiah Robinson Earl. This is kind of the forgotten man on the team. Like if you were like, oh, he's still here. Like, yeah, he is. And it doesn't necessarily surprise me that you were kind of, shocked by that sort of thing. Signed after he's cut by the Oklahoma City Thunder earlier in last season, signed on a 2-way deal, then converted. He's a Larry Nance Jr. kind of player. The small ball switchy center. He's 6'9" with decent mobility, and he can at times kind of shoot the 3, even if he doesn't do it particularly great, but plays a little bit bigger than he is. He, in theory, could be in line for more minutes than some of the other guys we've talked about. I expect him to play more than Yves Missi might. He could potentially be the backup center over a guy like Karlo to start the year. One of the things that he does well and that he would need to continue to do well is be an above average for his size defensive rebounder. When you look at some of the guys, Daniel Tice is not an elite defensive rebounder. Missi, we don't know just yet. Karlo, we don't know just yet. And we'll talk Trey Jemison in a minute here because Jemison isn't a particularly good rebounder for the size that he has. Jeremiah Robinson Earl, when you look at the guys on the team, might be the best defensive rebounding center that they have. If he can play and rebound the ball well, you can find minutes for him, I think. He doesn't offer you that rim protection, but he's out there on the perimeter. He can defend a little bit on the perimeter, probably about average for what you would expect for the position. If they want that kind of small ball switchy 5 that doesn't kill this team because he's a strong enough rebounder, that's Jeremiah Robinson Earl. If he can be a menace on the defensive glass, he can find minutes because he fits kind of the mold of what Willie Green seems to like. And that's a way for him to earn those minutes. Maybe it's Daniel Tice starting. Maybe it's Jeremiah Robinson Earl as that center off the bench and the guy you potentially would close with, even if we think they might close with Zion at the 5 or Herb at the 5 or Trey at the 5. Say they're not doing that yet. It could be a guy like Jeremiah Robinson Earl. Is that a great option? No. But if he's not hurting you by getting you those defensive boards, I'm not fully convinced that anyone else on this team can eat up the defensive glass just yet. So if he's capable of doing that, that I think is going to be an important way that he could earn some minutes. Knocking down threes too is what's going to really help him. We saw him immediately get minutes last season, knock down a couple of threes, but he's not a rim protector. He definitely looks overmatched against opposing centers, so you want him there for the switchability. But he also has to hold his own against centers, and that's where he's likely going to be kind of hurt and impacted by it and lose some minutes out. So let's wrap up the center talk by looking at Trey Jemison. This is someone that I think is maybe forgotten a little bit here. It was with the Pelicans in Summer League in preseason last year. We liked what we saw. Didn't end up making the team here, but finished the year pretty strong with Memphis. Played 23 games for them, 14 starts, almost 25 minutes per, averaged 7.4 points and 5.8 rebounds. That's all pretty good. He doesn't give you the shot blocking. He's a big dude. He's a big body, right? He's 6'11", 260 plus pounds. Like he looks like big down there. And that's maybe what this team needs when they have a lot of I don't want to say tweener centers, but a lot of guys that aren't kind of the traditional Jonas Valanciunas like 5s. he fits that kind of body type here. He's not a good rebounder, though. Last year, he did not rebound the ball well at all. He had a worse defensive rebounding percentage than Jeremiah Robinson Earl did. And when you think about the size disparity there, that's a little bit striking. Now, he is a beast on the offensive glass. He is very good as an offensive rebounder, in my opinion, but he's not the type of guy that is just going to actively secure a lot of those boards. He can go get you offensive boards and some putbacks, but that's not what this team needs. They need the rebounding, and he doesn't provide that. I think if he can give you the defensive rebounding, the fact that he's bigger and can go up against guys like Zach Edey and others, when can anyone else on the roster truly do that? That's his way to earning minutes. Be a strong defensive rebounder. Now, he doesn't play on the perimeter. He is not exactly an offensive lob threat or a pick and roll guy. He doesn't give you strong rim protection or anything like that, though he's not horrible at it. He's going to be kind of a situational big, and I don't know if they want to go that route where you're like, what center are we playing tonight? This is who our centers are going to be. But if he can rebound, he can defend some guys that probably no one else can on the roster. And when you combine that with the NBA experience here, that's, I think, something that's going to weigh heavily on Willie Green and his opinions of who do we start, who do we play. And that's the guy that I think could be in line for some significant minutes when it comes to that, but likely not. But there's a chance that he could earn them. They signed him on a two-way, as kind of a cheap insurance big, I think, and a guy that they liked and got a good firsthand look at a year ago. I think he could be in line for some sort of role. In theory, could you start him on opening night, potentially, at the center position? I don't think that's beyond the stretch of imagination. And then bring Daniel Tyson off the bench. Those are your two most experienced centers. So those are guys that could potentially go and earn those minutes. And you bring Karlo on a little bit slower. You bring Missi on a little bit slower. Then there's probably no real role for Jeremiah Robinson Earl. We talked about trading him in the show the other day anyway. Something to keep in mind when it comes to what the starting lineup might be here for the New Orleans Pelicans. Okay, so we'll talk rotation next week, general rotation talk, because we're going a little bit long here as we talk about some of these guys. But I want to look at wing minutes here. And so that's Jordan Hawkins, Javonte Green, Matt Ryan, Jose Alvarado, and Antonio Reeves. Let's start with Jose and kind of the obvious one, right? He's going to get minutes. He's maybe not the backup point guard if CJ's coming off the bench. CJ will fill a lot of that too. But that's kind of your guy, right? The hustle energy guy off of the bench. Exactly what he did last year. We absolutely love Jose Alvarado. His minutes seem pretty safe. He did really well, I thought, for Puerto Rico in the Olympics and leading that team that was, just completely an underdog in basically every single matchup. I thought that was good experience for him. The way he really solidifies his spot in this rotation, since that's kind of the angle that we're looking at everything here with, is be a more consistent shooter. He can shoot. We know he can shoot. We've seen him do it, but it's streaky and a little bit inconsistent at times. They need more shooting. They need to take more threes. That is an area where Jose Alvarado can potentially really make an impact. I'm done doubting him and, the fact that he's undersized, but the fact that he came in last year, shot 37.7% from three. That is a good number. I think that can go a long way. That's a significant improvement over the 33.6% from a year ago. Can he get closer to 40% on about 5 attempts per game from three? I don't think he'll get up to 5 attempts per game, but he was at 3.7 attempts per game last year, and he was pretty injured. And his minutes were down slightly from the year before that. If he can get up to 4 attempts per game at 40%, I will be thrilled with the production he gives you offensively, with organizing that offense, making the right passes, and just the hustle and energy and everything else that he does that we value so much. His way to earning significant minutes is by shooting threes, knocking them down. And I think he can do that. He really had some success with that in the Olympics. So if he can do that again this year, he's going to be in line for a bigger role in something we love to see, because I absolutely love Jose Alvarado on this team. So coming up next, Jordan Hawkins, Javonte Green, Matt Ryan, and Antonio Reeves. How do they earn minutes? What do they need to show? That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen. Today and every day, we're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this team. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now for your second listen, Locked On Saints. We're like right there for week one. Right there for week one and the start of the regular season. Ross Jackson's going to make sense of everything black and gold over at the Locked On Saints podcast. Make them your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's continue to look at how guys earn minutes here on this team. We've gone through the centers, what they need to show and the ways that their path to earning minutes. We just talked about Jose Alvarado. There's a lot more centers on the team than you realize as they try and kind of figure out the big man rotation here in New Orleans. So let's look at kind of the wings and guards here. Jose is fine. Like, he's going to earn minutes. We should have probably included him in like the safe bets, but it was worth talking about what he needs to do to try and, upgrade that just a little bit here. Other guys, though, let's start with Jordan Hawkins, who, is in line for a spot but struggled in Summer League. We know that he's a shooter. His challenge, what he needs to do is show that he's more than just a shooter. Now, he actually rebounds better than you realize, I think. I think he's a better defensive rebounder on this team than most people realize. He plays taller than he is. But you've got to do more than just do that because, look, everyone's got to kind of rebound no matter your position, I think. You need to show other areas. And for him, if he wants to stay on the court, it's going to be purely through defense, right? You have Javonte Green coming in. We'll talk about him just next here. He's going to push Hawkins for minutes because he's a Willie Green kind of guy. He's a defensive first hustle guy. While Hawkins is a catch and shoot, off-ball movement shooter that spaces the court and provides is an offensive threat. But you've got to make those shots. And he was a little bit up and down with that last year, shooting 36.6% from three on, if you were to do it over 36 minutes, 9 attempts per game. So the volume is high. That's got to be closer to 40% on high volume, I think. But even if it's not his court gravity, and you saw after earlier in the year when he played a significant role, he was on the scouting report, and teams were like face guarding him, trying to deny him the ball. That's useful, right? Anyone that draws the attention of a defense is good. Now, we know he can do that. I'm not worried about that. Defend. It's got to be defense. They need his shooting out there on the court, but he won't play if he doesn't defend. The entirety of the Pelicans' defensive scheme is not allowing guys into the paint because they don't have a true rim protector, right? You can't get beat, you can't get blown by and allow them to go to the rim because there's no true rim protector there. They were good about not allowing people into the paint last year. When people got into the paint, they scored at a very high rate against New Orleans. So you, knowing that, have to just not let them get in there in the first place. We're not looking for Jordan Hawkins to come in and force a ton of steals, do things like that. He really just needs to keep guys out of the paint. Don't get lost. Don't let your man get into the paint. Keep him on the outside of the three-point line. If he can do that, he's going to earn a lot of minutes this year. Javonte Green is a different story. It's kind of the reverse of this, right? He is like the Najee Marshall replacement. He's going to do all the hustle things. A lot of NBA people that I trust and seem to be really, really high on him. Okay, that works for me, but we want this team to skew a little bit more offensive than they have in the past. And if they're not going to do that, they're not going to find a spot on this team where they shouldn't be playing significant minutes. You saw Green close the year well for Chicago in 9 games, averaging 12.2 points per game. He has shot the ball better than an early part of his career. Last year on 3 attempts per game, 37%. Look, he's going to hustle for rebounds. He can move the ball a little bit. He can give you some steals. But you can't just run a negative offensive guy out there on the court. And look, for the most part of his career, he's not been a good offensive player. If he can knock down threes, though, and give you exactly what Najee Marshall gave you last year in kind of that, he's not as good as Najee, in my opinion. That's a guy, though, that can earn a spot in this rotation, and should be playing. Not one of those guys that just does play, but should be playing. I'm going to sneeze here, so I'm going to mute this. Okay, I have a mute button active on this mic here, so that was helpful. So you just can't trot out a zero offensive guy, even if they give you all the other hustle things, depending on how Willie Green has run the rotation in the past. If he can knock down your threes, we're going to love this guy, in my opinion. So let's keep rolling here with 2 more players. Matt Ryan, it's defense, right? All of this with these guys is going to be defense for the most part. You've got to be able to defend. Matt Ryan, as much as I like him as a shooter and was one of the top 3-point shooters on the team last year, was abysmal defensively. Not a good rebounder, too, for his size. For a wing player, you got to do one of those two things. Defend or grab boards. One of those two. They don't really give you either. There's a reason why they waived him, brought him back on a non-guaranteed deal with a chance to earn a spot on this roster. I'd like him to find a way. That type of shooting, being a threat like that, is a really useful kind of player. And, he has the size to be pretty good, I think. He struggled to kind of find a role in the NBA, or find a spot, I should say, in the NBA. We know what his role is. Go out and defend a little bit better. Hustle more if you need to. Something like that is what makes you more than just a shooter, and that's how he earns minutes here. And that's kind of end on Antonio Reeves, a guy that I was really high on, thought would be a good undrafted pickup for New Orleans. They traded up to get him in the second round. His is a little bit more complicated. You look for him to be more of a 3-level scorer than just a shooter. They're missing a little bit of that kind of like create your own shot spark plug off the bench. Like the type of guy that earns 6 Man of the Year awards oftentimes, right? The guy that comes in and is like, I'm going to score 20 off the bench. And while I don't expect that for Antonio Reeves, and I don't think that's necessarily what he's going to be capable of at any point, in his career, can you show some degree of that, right? You can do it on a smaller scale. Yeah, he's going to need to defend. But look, Jordan Hawkins isn't driving and attacking the basket, pulling up from mid-range, and creating his own three. That's not what he does. Matt Ryan's not doing that either. Green's not doing that either. Jose kind of, but different role. Reeves can be that just like, greased lightning scorer off the bench where you put him in and all of a sudden he can just go. He can score at all 3 levels. He can get to the rim and score. He can pull up from mid-range, and he can shoot the 3, and he can do it by self-creating. They don't really have that guy off of the bench here on this team outside of him. If he can kind of be that 3-level scorer, even if it's not, 10 points per game, that's a useful type of player that can keep defenses off balance. They don't really have anyone else who can do that with his kind of skill set. So while defense is going to be important for him too, making your shots at all 3 levels is truly what's going to earn him minutes, because if you can score like that and give this bench a boost, that's going to be an important thing. And New Orleans is lacking that kind of player, and I think that's a reason why they drafted Antonio Reeves and traded up to go and get him. So let me know what you think about all of the players that we talked about. How do they earn minutes? Who are the other 5 guys you think should be in the rotation? Is it 2 centers? And then, Jose Alvarado, and then, Jordan Hawkins, Javonte Green. Is it someone else? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. So next week, we're going to have a little bit of fun. I'm going to want your input on a couple of things. We'll tease that out this weekend. We'll look at the rotation and kind of building that out. When do guys sub out? When do they sub in? What does Willie Green need to change with the rotation next season too? That's coming up next week here on the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all next week.